We will guide you. And as she was leaving in that classic doorknob conversation, I can still see her ready to open the door. She said, "Folks, be gentle with yourselves. These are difficult conversations that we all need to have. And one of the ways we can make meaning of this heartbreaking time is for you to encourage each other and all those that you care about to get some resource materials and have these conversations before you have to." And then she added, "I ask that of all my colleagues because we ask it of the families we serve." And then she said, "Because we all have families too." Well, from that moment, I knew I wanted to do more of this privileged work. That was almost 25 years ago, and a chance to work with that physician, which I was fortunate to be able to do. This afternoon, I also want to pay homage to your life experience and vocational experience. Just scanning the group, it's a remarkable and humbling group to be with. And in this virtual context, we're just going to have an opportunity to explore some of those conversations that we all need to have. I want to lead off with a few comments about grief and ritual before and after death. And then, according to a survey that Dennis did, one of the most asked about questions is medical assistance in dying, as one of the ways that we die and are accompanied in our death. And my colleague from the hospital is going to speak to that, from a different hospital from the story, I might add. And then we're really fortunate to have your parish nurse, Christine, with some comments from her experience and expertise, including on advanced care planning, to help us get at some of the formal answer to that physician's question: what do you remember your loved ones saying about their wishes at a time like this? And as Dennis has indicated, we'll be available for Q&A and to linger after as is helpful, but we're aiming for about 90 minutes. So some stories here from the COVID context. I've tried to pull some of them from this past year, hoping it invites you to think about some of your stories. I don't want to minimize or generalize or pathologize grief. And I also want to acknowledge that grief isn't always about dying. There are other losses that can bring some of this about. I'm hybridizing these stories. In some cases, I have express consent and other implied consent, but I want to use the wisdom of Frederick Buechner, one of my favorite writers, who used to say, "Here's my story, maybe it'll help you to think about yours." So I'm going to start with my little poll of my own. Hands up. When I say the word Edelweiss, do you think of Christopher Plummer strumming a guitar in The Sound of Music with Julie Andrews and the 7 beautiful children? Well, that late great actor of the Shakespeare Festival, among other locations, died last month. I had had a chance to read his rather irreverent biography a couple of summers ago. It's entitled In Spite of Myself. And he reflects on his own mortality with these words. Imagine Christopher Plummer saying, "As I creep deeper into the twilight, it is not so much the fear of dying that disturbs me, but the sudden awareness that I've just begun to live and how dreadfully I'm going to miss it all if only I might linger by painting myself into the landscape so I could always see the beginning of the day." Well, so pleased that our Stratford Festival is going to continue, but we won't have Christopher, except perhaps painted into the landscape, and certainly fondly remembered, this man for all seasons. But he is reflecting, interestingly, some research done exploring faith in Canada that goes back just to 2017, about how uncomfortable modern Western society in particular is talking about death. 60% of Canadians apparently believe in some form of life after death, but there's no consensus about what form it takes. 57% profess a belief in heaven, but only 40% believe in hell. And I take the liberty to add, for many people I've been privileged to travel with, sometimes heaven and hell is right here on earth, but that's another conversation. Back in Christopher Plummer's imagery, which I really appreciated, not so much the fear of death, but a sudden awareness about painting himself into the landscape. I don't know his theology, and it doesn't really matter, but he invites us to think about what we believe. He said he wanted to always see the beginning of the day. And I wondered if he ever thought of that as seen through the eyes of those he has influenced and loved and been loved by. He didn't say that, but I meant taking the liberty to add to his quotation. I want you to go back many more years, 1924, and indeed a different faith tradition from our own, but Rabindranath Tagore was the Nobel laureate for literature. And he wrote, "Death is not extinguishing light. It is only putting out the lamp because the dawn has come," unquote. So eternal or afterlife could be understood as the dawn, but perhaps tending the extinguishing of the lamp, including in the hearts of those loved and loved by, is something that faith and ritual can help with. It was N.T. Wright, who's a biblical scholar and bishop in the Church of England, who made an interesting observation that sort of reminded me of Mount Zion. He observed, faced with death, religious communities embody a narrative of hope, displayed through corporate ritual, through acts of support. They are instinctual in their compassion as a community, a compassionate community. For those of us who follow Jesus and the story of the compassionate community he drew around him, I invite you to think of perhaps the most quoted, probably second to the 23rd Psalm, but the second most quoted passage of scripture in funerals, and that is from the 14th chapter of the Gospel according to St. John. And I just want to play back to you the first 3 verses and listen for one different word, different to your ear. Jesus was about 33 years old and he knew he was going to die. And he has his friends around him and he's remembered for saying, "Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. For in my Father's house are many abiding places. And if it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you?" Now, again, put up your hand if you haven't heard abiding in that translation before. You're probably more familiar with many rooms, dwelling places, mansions, and that's all fine. But a scholar of Aramaic, which is the language that Jesus and his friends spoke, has suggested that Jesus more likely said and meant abiding. In that wonderful double entendre of abiding with God when we die, but also in the lives of those we love. Think of the evening hymn, "Abide with Me." Abiding in the mothering love of God and those that we love. So despite a lack of common narrative, let alone belief around death, as the pollster tells us, we human creatures seem to agree that grief entails some kind of public expression. And I think that's probably one of the hardest parts of COVID. It's public in a sense, but it's not intimate like a hug. Grief is an experience of any kind of loss, just not just death, as I've said, but I'm often reminded, and I've learned so much from a group who used to call themselves the late church mothers, as opposed to the early church fathers. And she said, "I wish people would stop saying that I lost my husband. You make it sound like I misplaced him." She said, "He died. Why are we afraid of saying that?" And she has had a remarkable, and I've known her some 20 years, a journey of grief with her family and her friends and her faith community and her colleagues and her husband's colleagues. And it's made no less important, but I dare say more complicated by the limitations of pandemic. So we're trying to make meaning when it sometimes doesn't make sense. And here we are in a virtual gathering. I was on a funeral call last week. There were 300 people on Zoom. 300. And the minister, and then the musician, and then the different tributes were sitting where Dennis is now on my screen. But you know, there was still an intimacy and an authenticity to that. But we're coming into a time when people are saying, "I'm just going to have to wait till the time is right." But is it ever right? And I don't just mean to die, but to honor the death. And as those on their grieving continues, particularly those people who have been able to have some kind of a ritual, we're coming up to a time now a year later when they're asking themselves, well, we said we'd defer something, but maybe we need permission not to. It's a very interesting question. And I also know of faith communities and residential communities that are saying maybe we need to have a gathering that honors all the losses of this year or so and do it in that way rather than singling out any one. Besides, one of my other late church mothers has announced, I'm 85 years old. A lot of my friends have died this year and not of COVID, and I'm not going to 5 funerals a week once we get going. And I think I say that with tenderness, but I think a touch of humor, and she's got a point. But let me say, one of the change makers in this year has been technology. Not all for the good, but certainly to a lot of good. Let me tell you a story about a nurse. 92 years old, she introduced herself as a nurse until she went into the hospital with COVID. And it was right at the beginning of the lockdown, so her own family could not be with her. But as Christine will talk more about, as her breathing began to change quite suddenly, a very perceptive nurse rallied as many nurses on the floor who were free of hand. And they gathered around that nurse's bed and they held each other's hand, and one of them had a hand up high with a camera that went to the family who was waiting for the call. And she died. And her funeral was held about 4 months later, and I was asked to tell that story because that was so true of her, teaching us and equipping her colleagues even in her own death. As they say, you can't make this stuff up. Another time this summer, when we were busy counting to 10, we always had to count to 10. 9 family members and a presider, a casket or an urn, and the funeral home staff and others stepped back. But all of a sudden, we were 11, except it was a golden retriever who had jumped over the fence of the cemetery, and we could see the owner running in pursuit with obviously a chain that had broken free. And you know, that dog went right up and sat beside a 20-something young woman who was about to give a tribute to her grandfather. And she was very nervous. We'd suggested she go first. But she put up her hand and said to all of us, please, I was about to tell a story about a dog because my grandfather loved them. And apparently this dog knew that. And so she told her story, and then the owner was a little more comfortable taking the dog away. But I'm pointing to the noticing of instinctive ritual. It goes back to something N.T. Wright said. Sometimes we're creating ritual and we don't even know it. That holy one of many names, that unconditional love of a dog that comes to us as spiritual beings living out what we believe. Another challenge around counting to 10 were the family who did so well with that, and they brought in live stream and they planned for grandma's funeral. But the director very wisely said, is there anything else that you need? And they said, yeah, we need 12 people in the cemetery. We've been counting all weekend. We just can't get below 12. Whereas it is, we're leaving 2 people in the car and they really want to come in. So we just wondered if we could bury her twice. And the director said, yes, that's certainly possible. So we had a huddle among the family, 2 sisters in the lead. One of them really wanted to not be there when the casket was lowered, and the other one really did. So that sorted out the order, and we had 2 groups of 6, and bouquets were placed for those who couldn't be there, and it was live streamed to some others. I'll never forget it. Can we bury them twice? Just ask people what they need, and they probably will tell us. Ask yourself what you need. It's one of the best questions a chaplain ever wonders about. So I want to draw to a close this part, my part of the initial conversation. I want to turn to 2 other poets. One of my learnings through pandemic has been, oh, I sure can't write poetry, but I appreciate it more and more. And 2 have come to me in recent times, and I'm going to close with the wisdom of a young adult, pondering all of them, their mortality in these strange times. I want to begin with something Wendell Berry wrote called Summons of the Future. He speaks of the real work and journey in this life as if talking about pandemic towards our death that eventually comes to all of us. And he writes, it may be that when we no longer know what to do, we've come to our real work. And that when we no longer know which way to go, we've come to our real journey. The mind that is not baffled is not employed. The impeded stream is the one that sings. So from singing to dreaming and other imagery, As you may know, a turtle is often a symbol of the foundation of the world. Maybe you've had an experience of a turtle dream or a telephone call dream from a departed loved one, but that's another story too. Back to turtles. Turtle Island is how the indigenous people understand this transitory home we call Earth. And it was the poet Richard Levine who offered this very timely take, I thought, on the perception of a parent and a child. And it's entitled Sheltered in Place. And he writes, you watch your boy struggle with with giving up the turtle, returning it to the pond where he found it on a walk, first time you'd been out in so many days. How thoughtful he thought he'd been, making it a home in our home, where the family sheltered in place. How he cared for his armored friend. Having picked flowers, knowing that they'd die, you understand the urge to pluck the exotic, the beautiful, any diversion from fear, which is in itself a disease. That morning, you helped your boy give up the idea of living forever. Well, for some people, a snapping turtle has become a totem for this year in our frustration. But maybe in our insight, that's sometimes when we are acknowledging that we're frustrated and we're looking for questions that hopefully today's helping to answer. And religious traditions grounded in ritual is one of the ways we can do that. But there are limitations. We're back up to 50, but who knows, maybe we may have to go back down again in numbers. So our creativity, our patience is still needed. And as I mentioned to close, the struggle with grief is that it's not always about death. Sometimes it's what we anticipate or other things that we have lost. And with my privilege to conduct weddings, that's another whole group of people who've had a struggle this year. And something that a young man said to me in his 20s, in the middle of the summer, speaks to me about life and death. And he said this, you know, I've spent my life looking forward to what I know and fearing what I don't know. And pandemic has taught me to try to look forward to what I don't know. Try to look forward to what I don't know. You've heard me say making meaning when something doesn't make sense. That's the wisdom of Harold Kushner, among others. But I want to close with a benediction from that same position. And I've heard her say this many times, and I carry it with me. It says, you know, hope is envisaging a future that you want to be a part of. Hope is envisaging a future that you want to be a part of. And sometimes our hopes change. Sometimes they have to change. So I look forward to the presentations by Jamie and Christine and engaging your questions.
It's good.
Thanks very much, John. I love the story about the dog. Is that a true story?
Oh, yes, Dennis, that one is with permission from the family.
Okay. And I'm sure you have many more just like that. Thanks, John. There were a few people who came in late, and that was my error. Sorry you didn't get in right away. I was trying to do one thing and not able to do the other, but there were 3 or 4 people who are now with us. Welcome, but didn't get in right at the beginning. Now, earlier this year, I think it was this year, maybe it was December, we took a poll across Canada of people who are interested in this subject and what it is that they would like to explore. And there were many subjects, of course, but the one that was popped up right to the top was the subject of MAID, medical assistance in death. Now, to those of you south of the border, you may not be as familiar with it as we are, In some states, it's quite common. In other states, you don't talk about it. But I think whether you have come across it before or not, you'll find the discussion quite interesting. So Jamie has been close to the subject, both as a psychotherapist, a confidant, a counselor in the hospital setting. So welcome, Jamie. And I am the slide man for Jamie. And Jamie, if you wouldn't mind unmuting yourself, it works better that way. Jamie? You're still muted, Jamie. The unfortunate thing about Zoom is that I can mute people, but I am unable to unmute people. And you should be able to unmute. Let me just look. This is one of those technical things that sometimes defy.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Good afternoon, Jamie.
Good afternoon.
And
Yes.
one of the things that you would like is to see your slides, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And here we go. Go ahead.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. And bear with me if there's questions. I realize this is kind of a hot button topic with medical assistance and dying. So I'm kind of expecting there will be a lot of questions. In a lot of ways, I don't feel like I can cover everything. So we'll do the best we can. With my slides, I tried to give a more complete overview. I won't be reading them word for word, but I'm happy to share them later if people have questions that come up or if they're wanting to reference something later on that I talk about. Just briefly, my role at the hospital would be called chaplain. Formerly, I identified as a registered psychotherapist with the spiritual care team. I'm also a first responder when someone in the hospital makes a request for more information about medical assistance in dying. So I'm kind of called in if there's something that comes up, and I'll be the first one in the room who knows how the system works in general. I'm not like the doctor or the nurse practitioner who's going to do a formal evaluation and sign forms on their behalf. I'm really more like the reference person, first responder. I'll start with slide 2, which is a comparison between palliative care and MAID, because they're often confused. And it's often one of the first questions I get when I meet people in the hospital. They'll say, well, my palliative care doctor is going to do this, that, and the other thing, and why can't they just give me an injection? It's all simple. And some of the palliative care doctors cringe when they get identified that way. Others are more comfortable with the question, but there is a significant difference. Palliative care is a context of care. It's a philosophy of care. It's the whole picture of how do we provide comfort and symptom relief when somebody's undergoing a life-threatening illness. It's not all about end of life, but it can certainly include that. MAID is one specific intervention aimed to, at this point in time, resolve distress at end of life care. And it's not a big picture philosophy. It has to be seen in the context of a larger philosophy of care. So somebody can't say, oh, well, I'm a MAID doctor and have that include everything that they're trying to do. It's just one thing that some doctors and nurse practitioners feel able to offer their patients. But it's this philosophical difference that makes it hard. A lot of the palliative care community, when May came in, were very uncomfortable because they saw rightly that they were going to be identified even more as the death doctors, which they already felt they were unfairly labeled as. So they said, oh, great, now we're going to be told, okay, you're just like my veterinarian, you're going to give me an injection and off I go. Or that's all you want to do, you really just want to finish me off. So there was a lot of philosophical and moral distress in the palliative care community. I think things have settled out a little 4 years down the road, but I still hear a lot of debate. So I won't go further into it than that, but just to recognize, if you're talking to someone in palliative care, don't assume that they're comfortable with MAID, that MAID is their thing, or that it's just a natural extension of their practice, because there's a lot of debate about that. I go to slide 3, and where does MAID happen? At this point in time, for the Waterloo region, I'll talk specifically and more broadly of the Canadian context, most medical assistance in dying will either happen in the home or in hospital. There's very few residential hospices that allow it. And there's debate about whether they can continue to conscientiously object about it. There's actually some lawsuits that are working their way through the courts around that. But for practical purposes, if somebody is looking for medical assistance in dying, it would probably happen either in their home with the sort of home care services and a doctor, or it would happen in the hospital. There's some hospital-based palliative care units that will support people with that, including the palliative care unit here at Freeport that's part of Grand River Hospital. Medical family doctors will often respond to medical assistance in dying questions and requests as well, and they're usually connected with, if they can't answer the question directly, then they can at least point somebody in a direction where they could get more information. So I'll go to slide 4. Rather flippantly, I said, how is MAID like the Olympics? Well, for one thing, both were hotly debated in the Canadian House of Commons in the last 2 weeks, but for completely different reasons. Both were delayed by the onset of the COVID lockdowns. But what I'm really getting at here is both involve rings or hoops to jump through, specifically at least 5 for a medical assistance in dying request. So I'll switch to slide 5. I'm sorry, I'm getting a sense maybe not everyone can see the slides. I just saw something in the chat line that suggested that. Are people able to see it, or?
Yep.
I'm seeing a lot of shaking heads here that people can't see the slides. And lots of comments in the chat that people can't see it. So I'll continue in the meantime while we try to work out the technical things here. You haven't missed much. I'm really saying, in other words, what's written down in the slide presentation, and I'll be happy to pass it on to people later on. Basically, medical assistance in dying, there's 5 steps at a minimum. There's the initial inquiry, there's a written request, there's a first assessment, there's a second assessment, and there's the actual procedure itself. So the initial inquiry, what that means is basically who asks first, who asks the question, is medical assistance in dying something that would be available to me? We've had plenty of cases where people have said to us in the hospital, well, I didn't say anything to you because you didn't say anything to me about it. And I figured that you'd bring it up if it was important. So I figured I just wasn't eligible. But I've had many doctors say, my college won't let me bring it up because then I'd be aiding and abetting somebody and ending their life, and that's unethical. I don't think either argument is accurate, but there's still debate back and forth. For people who are interested in it, there's actually a really well thought out article that came out last year from a palliative care doctor, Susan McDonald, and it's called Leo Died the Other Day. And it outlines her work with a gentleman who was in advanced cancer, and she followed the guideline of, I can't talk about MAID with this guy. But then she was called urgently by the emergency room one day because he had taken an overdose, an intentional overdose, near the end of his life. And all of a sudden, everything they had been planning and working through methodically in palliative care was shoved aside by urgent care and then trying to resuscitate this dying gentleman. Basically, everything fell apart because there wasn't a space to talk honestly about what he was feeling, what he was hoping for, where life could go from here. So I'd reference people back to that article for a more complete discussion of the issues at hand, but the issues are still at hand. And I think this still goes on. The practical upshot of it all is if you know someone or you yourself are curious even about how this medical assistance in dying thing works, please bring it up with medical professional. They are required to at least entertain the question, and whether they go anywhere with it or not, they're not required to necessarily help you very far, but they can at least hear your question and refer you to someone else who can. There's a toll-free number to access the Ontario MAID Care Coordination Service. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but if you Google it, the number is readily available. There's lots of different resources out there. So I worry. I had a palliative care physician once who told me, I really worry that we're going to be pressuring patients into ending their lives prematurely and saying, oh, you're such a nuisance, why don't you just off yourself and we'll all be better for it. And I said, in my experience, I've seen exactly the opposite. I've seen a lot of people who were looking for information and weren't told because there was this sense that, oh, well, we won't talk about it. So there was a sense that I don't want to upset my doctor. I don't want to disappoint my care team. I don't want to have them think less of me or think that I'm not a good person. Therefore, I'll just keep my mouth shut and suffer in silence. So, like I say, an open debate still about how best to approach this. The second hoop to jump through with medical assistance in dying is the written request. So it's an official legal start of a MAID request. The requirement under the Canadian legislation is that you have something in writing. Currently, you need to have 2 witnesses, and the 2 witnesses to the document cannot be providing you with health care, and they cannot be recipients or believe they be recipients of your estate. So that severely limits it because the hospital also puts a further proviso that no employee of the hospital can witness these forms, because what if we did it wrong, or what if we misunderstood the person's intent, then we could be liable later on. In practical terms, it's made it very difficult to get this document, which should be fairly simple, filled out. The person can fill it out and sign it, but unless they've got the 2 witnesses there, it's not active. We can't do anything with it. So part of the debate in the House of Commons and the proposal to change the legislation is something to simplify the witnessing process. For the moment, we're still bound by the regulations, and there's organizations like Dying with Dignity Canada that actually have a volunteer witness program. So we work with them a lot of the time because people don't necessarily want to call their next door neighbor and say, well, you're not in my will, by the way, sorry, but can you sign this MAID form for me? And learn all sorts of things about my private business that you wouldn't normally know. And if somebody's part of the family, then it's much more complicated, because then, okay, well, no, you're not in the will either, but please sign my MAID form. It's not a good opening for a conversation. This form is a request. It's not a commitment. So often people will fill it out in preparation and anticipation of end-of-life care. And that's wise in some ways, because it begins the 10-day waiting period. There's an obligatory, written into the legislation, waiting period of a minimum of 10 days. And the clock starts at the time this written form is received by a healthcare professional. So then there's the first assessment. And the first assessment and the second assessment are the formal reviews by a doctor or a nurse practitioner. What they're really looking for are 3 things. They're looking for, does this person have the capacity to understand and appreciate what's going on in their life, what a medical assistance in dying request would mean to them, and basically, do they really get what's going on, or are they unable to process the information? And that's not a mundane question, because a lot of the time as we near end of life, capacity to understand is something that we lose. So it's a consideration, certainly. And the way the MAID legislation is written, you can't delegate a MAID decision to anyone else. It's always has to come from the person themselves. But as people get more in pain, as they need more pain medication, they tend to get more confused. It's a side effect of the medication, or it's a side effect of the illness. The second question that your doctor or nurse practitioner would ask is the person suffering from a grievous and irremediable medical condition? That's a question of existential suffering, and it's very hard to answer precisely. They put in these very litigious legal terms of grievous and irremediable, but what it really means is this something that's intolerable? Is this something the person cannot imagine continuing with? And final question is, are they near the end of life? Is their death reasonably foreseeable? And this provision is currently under debate in the House of Commons. But for the moment, a doctor needs to be able to say, yes, this person's life is nearing its natural end, and this disease will shorten their life considerably. So the first assessor goes through those three questions, fills out a form, and then submits it to the person's file. Then the second assessor comes either soon after or much later. It isn't required that they all come at the same time, and asks all the same questions again. These processes, these assessments can happen before a formal request is made or afterwards. All of these steps can be intermingled and done in different orders. But then the last part would be the procedure itself for medical assistance in dying. One of the people who has done an assessment then agrees with the other person, okay, I will be the actual provider of the injection. And it's almost always an injection of intravenous medication. So there's a fair bit of planning involved, particularly if the person's at home and doesn't have an IV line started. But even in the hospital, there's a bit of planning to say, how do we get this organized and done so that it takes a day or two to get all their ducks in a row. And the person must be capable of providing consent one more time. So even at the time of the injection, doctors will go and say, are you still in agreement with this? Is this something you want to do? And the person has to say clearly, yes, I understand what this is about, and yes, this is something I want. And about 7% of cases, over stats from 2019, about 7% of the cases, people were not able to provide that final consent. They weren't able to understand the question well enough to be considered eligible. Family and friends can be present. It all depends on the person's wishes. I've seen some very solemn end of life, other ones that are much lighter, although it's always sad. I think sometimes the person who's dying is the one who's most eager to keep it light, and everyone else who's seeing them go are the ones who are feeling it most keenly. It can be busy, it can be crowded in the room, or it can be kind of quiet or lonely. Honestly, people die as they've lived usually. I've seen people for whom they were very private and not very much into their emotions. That's not going to change necessarily at end of life. I don't think, from my experience, that there's this sudden epiphany that people have of, wow, I'm suddenly going to talk in deep, heartfelt tones about what life means. Sometimes they're just, no, I'm good. Thank you very much. Very polite to you all, and bye now. I think sometimes we impose on others what we're looking for when it comes to end of life, that they should have the good death and they should do it the right way, whatever that right way means. And people die as they die. So I don't think medical assistance in dying necessarily changes that much for the person themselves experiencing the process. I'll talk to you about, well, I've given you the overview for medical assistance dying. I'll take a minute to talk about some of the legislative changes because I've referenced them a couple of times. Actually, there's currently a time limit that's been shifted a number of times by the courts. But right now it's, I believe, the end of March that the Canadian federal government is required to provide a new legislative framework for medical assistance to dying that takes into account some of the court cases that went through Quebec. The proposals are 3 or 4. The reduction in the number of witnesses for that formal form that I said, they're talking about reducing it to 1 person, and that the witness could be a healthcare professional. So this would be game changing, although you may still have hospitals that are wary of allowing their staff to witness forms, but it would certainly streamline the process quite a bit. And now they're talking about people receiving MAID even if their death is not reasonably foreseeable. There'd be more stringent safeguards built in. There's a lot of debate about what that would look like, but basically it would include people who are, say, chronically ill. They still have to be meeting the grievous and irremediable suffering, existential distress and suffering. They'd have to demonstrate that their situation was to them intolerable, but they wouldn't necessarily have to be at death's door. There's been talk about whether mental health conditions would make someone eligible for MAID. That's been put off by 2 years, but that's still an active debate. And there's a proposal to allow advance directives for MAID, and that's been set aside by the House of Commons. So that would mean people still can't write it in their advance directive that if I meet these conditions, then I want you to ask for MAID on my behalf. That still is not in the legislation and doesn't look like it will be this time around. I'm conscious of time. There's lots more. This is a big question. What I haven't really touched on is more of the values debate, more of the, essentially, is MAID the right choice? And that's an extremely broad question. It's a good one. I'm not going to try to touch on it right now, but if you have questions relating to it, I'm happy to talk more. I have lots of ideas about it. There's lots to debate back and forth, but I'll leave it at that for now. And I'll pass it back to Dennis and Christine.
Thank you very much, Jamie. I'd just like to add one thing to it. There is a most interesting documentary, and if you got a pencil in front of you and you're interested, it's called My Last Project. It's a Canadian documentary, and you can find it on GEM, G-E-M, which is the free documentary place in Canada that you can reach these things. My Last Project is about that woman you may have remembered in Halifax, who 2 years ago chose MAID rather than going through a very complex illness. And the camera follows her from the very beginning to the very, very, very end, as the people are having a little party in the hospital, and she moves from the party room into the room where she will be getting the injection. And then because she is donating her organs, it shows then her movie, or them moving her on. So it's a very gripping documentary, and if that's the sort of thing that you're interested in, it's called My Last Project on GEM. So thanks, Jamie. Thank you. There's going to be lots of questions for you. I'd like to call on Christine. Christine is the parish nurse at Mount Zion Lutheran Church. And that may sound very simple. It's a very, very complex position that Christine has. And Christine, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself. And evidently, I didn't know this, but I have to send you a little note, ask to unmute. There we go. So Christine, you're on.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Does everyone want to just take 5 or 10 seconds and just stretch or take a few deep breaths or wiggle around? It's that time of day I remember this was the exact right around the time of day when I worked as a charge nurse in long-term care, and you'd kind of run all day, and then you'd sit to kind of get report ready and chart, and then it would hit you. You'd sit and then you'd get tired. So take 10 seconds and move around, and I'll just grab my notes here. Okay. Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be with you today. Today I will speak on the topics of advanced care planning and how we die. First, I would like to introduce myself. As Dennis said, I'm Christine Ransiren. I'm the registered nurse employed in the role of parish nursing at Mount Zion Lutheran Church in Waterloo, Ontario. Prior to becoming a parish nurse, I worked in long-term care in various roles and at Grand River Hospital in Kitchener in surgery and for a brief time in ICU. The majority of my experiences in advanced care planning and caring for those dying come from the 24 years I worked in long-term care. It is from those experiences that I will share from. Advanced care planning. Advanced care planning is about deciding who will make healthcare decisions for you if you are unable to, and having conversations with them about your wishes, values, and beliefs to help them understand how you would like to be cared for. Ideally, these conversations should happen long before that person or people need to make those decisions for you. Breaking that description down further, advanced care planning essentially involves two steps. The first one is to identify your future substitute decision maker or substitute decision makers. The second step is to have a conversation with them about your wishes. This conversation may need to happen over several conversations, or maybe more. Ideally, it would be something that is discussed over time to allow both parties time to give meaningful thought to it, as well as time to process and reflect on it. I would encourage you to consider having a yearly talk about your wishes, especially if you are experiencing health changes that may cause change in your overall health condition. It would be wise to also discuss these wishes with other family members and close friends if they are a support to you. Making your wishes known to many will allow for future support to those who have to make those difficult decisions on your behalf for you someday. When do you need a substitute decision maker? What does it mean to be capable to make your own decisions? Let's clarify these questions. According to the Healthcare Consent Act, you are mentally capable if you have both A, the ability to understand the information that is relevant to the decision to be made, and B, the ability to appreciate the reasonable, foreseeable consequences of a decision or lack of decision. It will be the healthcare provider proposing the treatment who will decide if you are capable. It is important to note that your substitute decision maker must meet the following requirements. They need to be available when a decision is needed. They need to be capable of giving consent. They need to be willing to accept the role. That's an important one. They need to be 16 years of age or older, and they need to be not prohibited to act in the event, not prohibited to act as in the event of a court order or legal separation, etc. It is important to note that if you do not legally designate someone to be your substitute decision maker, just through a legal document indicating the power of attorney for personal care, then an automatic substitute decision maker will be determined by the hierarchy list from the Healthcare Consent Act. You can find this on acpww.ca. This website has numerous helpful resources. Once again, it is acpww.ca. This predetermined hierarchy may be completely fine with you. You may choose your spouse first, and then your parents or children next, and so on. But there may be times when you would opt for a different person. A quick review of the chart in the order of first substitute decision maker to the last is, starting at the top, a court-appointed guardian. Next is an attorney for personal care, followed by a representative appointed by the Consent and Capacity Board. Those first three layers, what I call layers of the hierarchy, are legally appointed. Next comes a spouse or partner. Next followed by parents or children, followed by parents with right of access only, followed by siblings, followed by any other relative, and finally, a last resort, which would be a public guardian or trustee. It is also important to give consideration to this hierarchy at least yearly if you are relying on it for a substitute decision maker. Changes for your substitute decision maker in areas such as employment, home relocation, health conditions, relationships, etc., all play a part in this. In addition, it was stated on a recent educational event that I watched through the Hospice of Waterloo Region that all those on each section of the hierarchy need to be in agreement. For example, your parents and children are in the same section, according to that chart. If you do not designate a substitute decision maker, all of those capable and over 16 years of age in that section all have to be in agreement of decisions that are made on your behalf. When considering this, you may wish to designate only 2 or 3 of them. You could name each one as able to make decisions on their own, or in combination with others, or even 2 out of the 3 could make a decision. There are plenty of options, and seeking legal advice is recommended when considering this option. When I worked as a charge nurse in long-term care, we would have a meeting with the resident, if they were available, their family, as well as various members of the care team at least once a year. To make their wishes well known to everyone, they would sign a medical directive. This would clearly allow all involved in their care to know their wishes in writing. Many who lived there were very clear in their intentions to have no heroic measures done for themselves or for their loved one in the case of a substitute decision maker, as they wanted them to remain at the home and kept comfortable if there was a significant change in their health condition. For some, they wished to have all possible measures available given to them, such as CPR, ventilator use, hospitalizations, etc. As time went on and the years passed, often their health changed, causing a decline in their condition. The yearly review was a good opportunity to review their care needs and overall condition, as well as their medical directive. It often became quite apparent that what was once desired for care no longer fit in with their current values, desires, or health prognosis. Had we not reviewed their advance directives once a year, we would not necessarily be following their current wishes in the event of a medical emergency. In my years of working in long-term care, I saw the benefits of our frail elderly remaining in their long-term care home to receive medical care for a variety of health emergencies rather than them being transported to hospital. This was so very apparent when dealing with health emergencies of those with advanced dementia. At many stages of dementia, it can be incredibly scary, confusing, and unsettling for them to be transferred to an unfamiliar place with unfamiliar staff. This highlights the importance of regular review of a person's advance directives, because a choice made for healthcare one year may not be the desire the next year. That all being said, I'm not negating the need for emergency hospital care as appropriate or desired. This is just an example of where one may choose to make changes to the original plan for care. You may be wondering to yourself about how you're going to have that initial conversation with your chosen substitute decision maker, let alone a regular or yearly conversation with them. There are some great resources available on that website I shared earlier. Perhaps for you, starting the conversation could be as easy as saying, I recently joined a Zoom event that Mount Zion Lutheran Church hosted, and it made me realize that there's an important conversation we need to have. As you become more comfortable with discussing your wishes, you may want to share your thoughts with other close family members and friends. I mentioned this earlier, and I'm repeating it again. It is ideal for everyone involved to know so that they can confidently stand together with those who are making the difficult decisions on your behalf, knowing that this was what you wanted. It may be of value to consider having copies of your power of attorney and your medical directives for healthcare handy in the event of an emergency. When I worked in long-term care, those papers were always at the front of the chart so that they were easily accessible in the event of an emergency. In the retirement section of that home, there was a pouch that hung from the back of their apartment doors to hold copies of their medical directives and power of attorney for health. It was intentionally there for emergency personnel, such as paramedics, as well as the resident to easily access in the event of emergency. The thought has crossed my mind that it would be helpful for all of us to have a copy of our power of attorney with substitute decision makers and any choices we know we want for sure for our health care close to our main entrance or front door, maybe tucked into a drawer of a table near the front door, or left in an envelope on a shelf near the door. An emergency is not the time to go searching for missing keys for the cabinet or safe you locked your papers in. For those living in their own homes in Ontario and would like to have something legal in writing for their care, such as no CPR, to be honored by both the emergency response personnel as well as hospital staff, there is a very specific form that needs to be obtained, completed, and signed by the appropriate people. In speaking with a friend last night who is a longtime paramedic locally, she said that this continues to be an area of great confusion. There is only one form that all emergency responders as well as hospital staff can honor. It is a special numbered form that comes from the Fire Marshal's Office and the Ministry of Health. Without this form, they cannot honor your wishes if it goes against their normal response protocols, which it would include things like CPR and defibrillation. Although these conversations with your loved ones can feel awkward or uncomfortable to many, I promise you that the more often you have them, the easier they become. Many do not talk about what the future might hold or that they will die someday. We will all die someday. So let's be proactive and start having these conversations. I think that your conversation with someone may inspire them to do so with their people, and so on and so on. Let us normalize these very important conversations. How we die. Professionally, I have seen some really remarkable and peaceful deaths. Personally, those who I have loved and have passed have all done so unexpectedly and suddenly, which has not allowed me the opportunity to sit with them at their bedsides and say goodbye. I share to let you know that we don't always know when or how we will die, but that sometimes there can be some really beautiful moments at the end of our lives. Shortly, I will tell you one of my favorite stories about a lady named Elsie. I was proud of the excellent palliative care we were able to give to so many in long-term care when I worked there. Although I did see some death in my hospital work, it was my years in long-term care that brings me so much experience. There are physiological changes that happen to a person and their body when their end of life is near, and I will list some. They may sleep more or sleep most of the time. They will have a decrease in appetite and a decrease in thirst, and they will probably progress to no intake at all, no fluids or food, or very little. They may be incontinent of urine or stool. They may be restless. They may be confused. Seeing things, reaching for things others can't see, or talking about people or visitors that others can't see is common. Changes to the color of their skin, which can include cyanosis, which is a bluish colored skin, pale skin, red purple, or totally purple skin, which is a late sign that often shows in dependent areas of the body, such as feet and legs, buttocks, and back. It is called mottling and is caused by poor circulation as the body shuts down. There is also changes to breathing. There can be rapid breathing or slow breathing, and pauses in breathing. Gurgling or rattling sounds while they breathe. There's chain stoke breathing, which is a pattern of breaths associated with many when near their end of life. Breathing starts normally and progressively gets louder and sometimes faster, and then stops for a period of time. This pattern can repeat itself every 30 seconds to 2 minutes and can occur for a few minutes or a few hours. It can be quite concerning for loved ones to see this. I believe that many people know they are dying long before the physiological signs show up or before a doctor or a test tells them so. I have cared for many who knew without being told that their days left were numbered. After their passing, as family and loved ones would talk, It became apparent that the conversations leading up to their loved one's deaths included clues that they knew they were going to pass. Sometimes subtle, and yet not always, these were cherished memories held tight. Another interesting thing I noted with almost every death was that in the days or weeks before a person passed away, they usually had a day or two where they were the best they had been in years. They may look different for everyone, or this may look different for everyone, but many were talkative, alert, reminiscing with visitors, cheerful, and more. It was not unusual for families to say, "Today was the best visit I have had with Mom in years," or "I can't get over how alert Dad was today. We had such a great day reminiscing about old times and family and friends. He hasn't done that in years." Those days were truly gifts for their loved ones. I have heard of this happening to others outside of the nursing home many times, and it always makes me smile. What a wonderful memory to be left with. As a nurse, I would always try to prepare family and friends for the symptoms they may find their loved one experiencing. I would try to do this ahead of time if possible. When medical signs were evident that a person was nearing the end of their life, they would enter into a phase of their care called palliative care, and this was in long-term care. This time was often described by families as a gift or precious last time together. Families were cared for in addition to the resident. I would describe it as something similar to hospice care in one of our local facilities. Family and friends of the resident were welcomed at all hours, day and night, and made to feel comfortable. Beds were made to allow loved ones to stay overnight or rest in bed if needed. Recliner chairs were placed right at the bedside to allow family and friends to rest in comfort close to their loved one. Meals and snacks for the resident's loved one were provided to each room. It was a Mennonite home, and often hymn music would play in the room, and sometimes families would sing, read from the Bible, or say a prayer. And oftentimes staff could be found doing the same thing for the resident. I would say that some of my richest blessings from working as a nurse have been in the journey of caring for and walking with those residents and their families who were dying. There are not many opportunities in life to be part of such a profound and precious moment as this. I want to share the story of Elsie's death. Elsie was a wonderful elderly lady in her 90s, and her two granddaughters are two of my closest friends. I share this story with their consent. Elsie had lived her life in Toronto until her husband passed away, and then she moved closer to her granddaughters. Her own daughter had passed away when the granddaughters were young, and her son lived in Arizona, so it was just the two granddaughters who cared for her. She moved into the retirement area of the nursing home I worked at. She was full of life and enjoyed outings with her granddaughters and their children. But in time, she began to feel not well. It ended up that Elsie had cancer, and by the time they had discovered it, it had spread. It was up to her if she wanted to pursue treatments, but they were not hopeful that it would be of any help. So Elsie chose to not have any treatment. Elsie was a Christian and believed in heaven. She missed her husband and daughter terribly and was looking forward to seeing them again, and she knew that her time on earth was short. I believe that this was a Thursday that she decided to not pursue treatment. Plans were made on Friday with her family doctor for her to be connected with palliative care that Monday. She spent the day Saturday out and about with her granddaughters. They had a great day. On Sunday morning, as she sat visiting with her granddaughters in her room, she decided that she wanted to call each of her family members. She called them, she told them that she loved them and that she was proud of them, and spent time on the phone telling them about all of the specific things and moments in their lives that she was proud of them about. After that, she laid down in her bed for a rest. It was around that time that I decided I was going to head into work to catch up on some paperwork. I had this feeling that I needed to check in with my friends to see how their grandma was doing, as I hadn't spoke with them in a couple weeks. They both said that they were at the home with her and that she had chosen to not pursue treatment for her cancer at her appointment that week. I felt like I needed to check in person that day, and I am glad I did. When I walked into the room that afternoon, she was still resting. I took one look at her and I knew that she was going to pass away that day. Her granddaughters were unaware. The nurse in her retirement home had gone home for the day, and the palliative care referral appointment was scheduled for the next day. I was not her nurse, but I felt that I needed to help. Her granddaughters had some of her favorite music playing, and I was able to motion to them to come out of the room. I took them aside and told them that I thought she looked not well and that I thought she might pass away that evening. They told me about all the phone calls she had made earlier in the day. They knew she would not want to die in the emergency department waiting for help, so we decided to see if we could care for her in a room. We had no medications or supplies in the event that she became uncomfortable. This was unexpected for that day, but we decided we were going to do our best to keep her comfortable, and we cared for her in her bed. We dressed her in her favorite nightgown with her shawl around her shoulders, as she often used when sitting in her chair. Her favorite music continued to be played in her room. She did not wake or speak. Her granddaughters sat beside her. They reminisced as she slept. You could see the slight changes to her color and breathing with each hour. She was very peaceful and appeared comfortable. After a few hours, we stepped out of the room and I asked my friends if they had had a chance this weekend to tell her that they will be okay when she goes. They both said she knows we will be okay, but I suggested that they tell her that they will be okay when she goes and that they will take care of each other. I sensed that Elsie needed to hear this. They gathered on either side of her and lovingly told her that they would take care of each other and that they would be okay. The second they finished telling her that, her breathing dramatically changed. Her condition instantly seemed more poorly. They saw it too. She remained this way for a while. She seemed to still be holding on, and once again I took my friends out into the hall and I said, I think it may help her to go if you tell her that it's okay for her to go. We went back into her room this time. They leaned onto her bed on either side of her and wrapped their arms around her and told her how much they loved her and that it was okay for her to go and join Grandpa and their mom in heaven. They would be okay and would take care of each other. Her breathing changed immediately, and these were her final minutes. Her breathing was irregular. She looked like so many I'd cared for in the past who were in their last few minutes. She passed away in the loving care of her granddaughters as her favorite music played. This was just 6 or 7 hours after she sat in her recliner making her calls to her family. This was such a beautiful moment to witness. Usually as a nurse, I would be in and out of the room many times during this period of time, but I was able to be constantly present with the family as their friend. It will remain as one of the most beautiful passings I have ever seen. If you ever wonder if a person who is unresponsive or close to death can hear or understand, I think this scenario answers it for us. And if I could choose how I will go someday, I want to be like Elsie. My stories of peaceful deaths were the majority of the deaths I experienced in my years as a nurse at a Christian nursing home. There are times in life when people are not ready to go. I do understand this, and I saw some of this during my hospital work. In all of these cases, I witnessed people who were young and their impending deaths were not part of their plan for the stage of life they were currently in. Those are very difficult journeys. For so many deaths that I witnessed in that Christian long-term care home, they were peaceful and beautiful. They were an honor to have been a part of as a nurse and have left a lasting impression on me. I thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Christine. And I will ask, first of all, John and Jamie to unmute themselves, if you don't mind. I would like to point out too, very important, particularly in this area, that we have a very, very active hospice. And it would serve anybody well who's interested in some of the things we've talked about today to go to the hospice site in KW. It's KW Hospice. And there's a lot of things, and they do offer programs that you can enroll in. As a matter of fact, they even have a reading club, which I am part of at the moment. It's obviously we're reading about death at the hospice. I also need to apologize. I understand that the slides, nobody saw the slides. Well, I just pushed the wrong button, folks. I'm sorry, unintentional, but that's Zoom for you. In terms of questions, we're getting pretty near the end. Let's take about 10, maybe 15 minutes at the most, and questions, and then Christine will stay on board. And anything else that you want to talk about, she's willing to do. And I see that Shelley has pointed out to me, it's the Hospice of Waterloo Region. Thank you, Shelley. And Christine, you're still muted, are you? Okay, there we go. So some of the questions that have come up, and there's still room if you have questions that you would like to ask. John, I see you're busy there making notes. Maybe I don't even need to read any of the questions off there. Did you have some that you would like to respond to?
Thanks, Dennis. I do draw people to the chat because Shelley's made a helpful comment about forms. I mean, this is always more involved than we can capture in 90 minutes. So hospicewaterloo.ca is an excellent website. I commend Echo Dennis' comment. Somebody on the chat was asking about Wendell Berry, and the title you're looking for is The Summons of the Future. The Summons of the Future. I am aware of 3 questions that came in ahead. Dennis, should I touch on
Yes.
those? They're quick
Why don't you?
answers. And that gets people's juices flowing, and then we'll make the best use of Jamie and Christine's time. The first one, is there any kind of form? In this case, we're talking about funeral service planning. And my encouragement is to have a conversation with a funeral director who might work in a funeral home or at a cremation service, because they have formats that with no cost obligation, you can just have that conversation and they can keep a file. But importantly, tell people who you talk to. Tell them where the form is. Some people even put it in a Ziploc bag in their freezer because it's fireproof and people know where it is. So give that a thought. Was asked quickly about green options. Yes, increasingly they are available. Again, I'm not a funeral director, but I encourage you to talk to one. It'll be nearly 2 years ago that a green section opened in the Parkview Cemetery, which involves essentially shroud burial. It can be explained, and I'm already over my limit of knowledge, but it's a different kind of burial container. It's more than a shroud, but it's less than a casket with nails and so forth, assuming it's the plan there. And the other one was interesting about so-called cremated remains. Person asking, did they provide nourishment for plants? Well, I can't really speak to that except to tell you they're usually in a container unless they are scattered, because part of what she was asking was, can it be on private property? And again, I'm not a funeral director, but the Ontario legislation talks about the reverent disposition of the dead. So that always has to be kept in mind. And yes, you can put cremated remains on your own private property, not somebody else's. And again, a director could guide you, including about the possibility of putting them into water, a body of water. There's a way, if that gets at those 3 questions.
It's interesting, John. I asked my father what he did with my mother's remains. And he said, well, she was a great golfer. I scattered them over the golf course.
And I'll just say a word on behalf of municipal golf courses. Please do not do that. It became such a problem in this area that it became an opportunity. And the Kitchener cemeteries, I don't hold the torch for any one of them, have opened a grotto that is a putting green, so that those ashes can be near a golf course setting, but please do not. And that is not reverent disposal, and it's not your private property. As much as you might love your loved one,
Right.
or they love golf.
Well, I can't say that to my father now. He's gone too. So. Other questions. one question was about the fear of dying. A person expressed to me the tremendous fear of the end, seeing it as the very end. Does anybody have any comments on that?
That's a tricky one.
That's a prickly question.
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess what I would like to offer to that is that based on my experience, that for those that had a faith base or a spiritual belief of there being something after their life on earth, heaven or whatever, their belief was that this was the passing, their death was part of the journey and that they were heading on to something. And so I think that what I experienced at the nursing home with mostly Mennonite, but all Christian people, pretty much all Christian people who passed away, was that this was kind of something they had kind of lived their whole lives for this final, their final passing and going to heaven. And that was very peaceful. And what I did experience in that situation is that for their families who did not have a faith base or a spiritual belief of something after, death was a very distressing situation for them. Not just based on my experiences, but that it was just a very end, and that there was nothing more to it. So anyways, perhaps someone else can speak
Jamie, a question directed to you. I've heard this question actually from two people, and it's the whole issue of when you fill out all the forms and you get the permission and you decide that 2 weeks from now or 1 week from now it's going to be the end. In both cases, the question was, it's past now, but the question was, that period between the decision and when it happens, they found was the most stressful period of all. More stressful than anything else, just the waiting period.
Yeah.
Could you address that, Jamie?
Yeah, I would agree. I had experience with one family where the person, as was their right, decided to put off the date by an extra week. And that was more stressful. And I heard that from family members. So like, goodness, it was bad enough as it was, but now we're sort of staring death in the eye for another week. And we don't know what to say to each other anymore. So that part is a definite difference with MAID compared to other ways of dying. I'm not sure if I have an answer for that, but that certainly is an effect of the whole process. It's very strange. We don't have a lot of language for anticipating end of life quite so directly, where we can say we know with very high likelihood the hour and the day. That's not how our cultures have learned to deal with death up until now. So that is one very distinct difference. And I'm not sure that it doesn't make things easier for anybody, honestly.
No.
It does add to the stress. I'm not sure how to say that, how to ameliorate that distress. I think the more easily families can talk amongst themselves about feelings, the easier it is to deal with them, because I think it's a stress of pent up anxiety. It's pent up fear. So if the fear can be let out, talked about freely, if the person who's dying can talk with the other people who are caring for them, that makes it easier. But yeah, it is a fact of how MAID is done that people will know. They kind of go in eyes wide open. It's similar to people going in for a major surgery. It's harder to do that than it is to suddenly fall and break your hip and be raced to the hospital and need hip surgery. It's much harder to do it when you kind of go in eyes wide open, as it were.
Dennis, if I could just pick up and maybe link the two questions. I did most of my training under Roman Catholic nuns, and I will always be grateful to them. They always taught us to ask open questions, beginning with words like how, that didn't have a yes or no answer. The notable exception to that is that same doctor I spoke of, who every time I heard her do an assessment, she said very directly, "Do you have fears?" And it's amazing how open people were to answering that question, because they could have just said no.
Yeah.
She asked them and she named it as fear. While you're on the floor, in the chat was a question, could MATE happen at a hospice? And what's the experience like? Two questions, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I saw that. At the moment in Waterloo Region, the residential hospices are not supporting MATE. So actually, if someone goes to a hospice for palliative care and then says they want medical assistance in dying, they will be told by the hospice that they'll need to leave and go be somewhere else if they want to receive this. That's not the case with the hospital-based hospice palliative care unit at Freeport, but for Innisfree, Lessard, Hospice Wellington, that is the case. There's debate about that and whether that should continue to be the case, but that's the state of affairs right now. As to the actual physical experience of MATE, it is peaceful. I've been witness to a number of them. The first it's a series of 3 injections, but the first injection puts the person to sleep. It's very similar to what's used in putting someone to sleep during a surgical procedure, but the dosage is much higher. And then the second injection and the third injection are to induce the heart to stop, and a paralysis too, so that there's no tremors or distress in that way. Occasionally, there may be, like at one point, there was a little quiver, and somebody was pointing to the jugular vein and saying, "See, I can still see a heartbeat there." But it was very hard to say. The doctor had a physical explanation for it as part of the dying process, but it is very, very peaceful.
Mhm.
Part of the question is it like when I had my dog put down? Essentially, a lot of the medications are similar. So it's not pharmaceutically complicated. It's medications that are well understood and that we can have a very predictable effect. And they actually, the doctors do keep a second dose available in case for whatever reason, like the IV doesn't go in the right vein or something, then they're all set up for a second IV port being in place at the time and for a second dosage of medication available. And the amount of medication they're using is usually 3 times as much as will likely be needed. So.
Very interesting, very interesting. Now, I do remember my parents lived in the States, and when my mother died, one of the first things my father said to me, he said, we had the hospice people coming into our home on a regular basis. And he said 2 things. He said, I didn't realize what the hospice was all about. And second, his response was, I didn't realize how helpful they were. That in retrospect, he said, that was probably the most helpful thing to him in the entire process. So one needs to keep in mind this sort of thing, the things that are available, the people that are available, the institutions that are available, that all of these go to making, I'm not going to say it good death, all these go to making life and death the way it should be. Those are my words. Not very good. Anyway, it is now 3 o'clock. We promised you that we would be, as they say in school, out at 3. And so we are going to go out at 3. I hope that what we've talked about this afternoon has been of somewhat helpful. We know that we could not cover everything that you might be interested in. It's just an impossibility. I mean, there was over 50 people here. And we tried to do our best, tried to figure out what it would be of most interest to people. And I think we did cover a lot of interesting things. So that was number 2 of our series. And number 3 certainly won't be next month, I can assure you that. But number 3 will come along eventually, and we'll try and fill in all the little holes that we've missed. So to everyone, except those who would like to stay a little longer and just talk to Christine, it would be you and Christine, and I've learned now how to unmute you or help you unmute. By next year, I will be an expert in Zoom. This year, I am not an expert in Zoom. So there you go. One other thing. Can you see it? Julie, look at the picture on the credenza. That's a personal thing. Anyway, folks, thank you for participating this afternoon. Godspeed and stay safe. And those who don't leave, I will unmute. And thank you, Jamie and John and Christine, for giving us your time. Most helpful. Thank you.
A pleasure.
Hi, I have a question for Christine.
Hi.
Hi, Christine. My mother, who is 84, is in long-term care, actually in Roberta Place in Barrie. Yeah, and she has just been in isolation for 8 weeks during the variant virus. She has Alzheimer's, has had it for about 8 years. She wants to die. She wants to be with my father. She has a strong faith, and she is losing all will to live. Essential caregivers are still only allowed to visit her, my 2 sisters in Barrie. So I'm concerned that at some point she might just die and none of us will be there. What are we to do?
Right. Do you worry about not being there with her?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I understand. My grandmother passed away unexpectedly. My mom's joining us today, and it was her mother. And I'll try not to cry, but I was so sad that I had sat at the bedside and cared for so many people who had passed over the years, and I wasn't able to be with her. So I understand what you're saying. That being said, there are an awful lot of people in long-term care that pass, I would say, within minutes of their family leaving the room. So I've seen where families will spend days or weeks being at the bedside, kind of a vigil, people taking turns being with them, and it's like I have seen more times than not, the family will get up to get a cup of coffee, or someone will say, we're going to slip just to the first takeout place and come back with a meal. And their loved one passes in that time. So I think that they wait, they wait till their family is out of the room often till they go. Maybe John can speak to that as well, but that has been my experience. So as much as it's difficult to not be there, I understand what you're saying, and yet you could be there and leave for a couple minutes and it's hard. John, can you add anything to that?
I've got 2 quick comments, just to remind ourselves that we understand hearing is the last faculty we lose. Don't underestimate the chance to put a telephone by her ear. I heard the story of the nurse where they brought people into the call. I also want to tell you about a couple that were married for 60 years. She went to hospice, he could not go, but he called me to his chair and said, I have a job for you. want you to go and hold my wife's hand and tell her it's mine.
Oh.
And I'll never forget the privilege of that mission. And I couldn't stay until she died, but the nurses knew that hand holding was so important that they tried to keep it up until she did die. And
Wow.
they were to keep saying,
Unbelievable.
tell her it's mine. And for her, I believe it was.
That's
So
awesome.
I offer those two suggestions.
Yeah. The other thing is that we can use technology to connect us. And I don't know if we can, not that I want to promote, I think we're getting a little bit of background noise. I don't know if everyone else is.
Yeah.
Know what that is, but anyways, if anyone can figure it out, then we'll just have to mute our mics. As far as using technology, I don't want to promote any specific product, but I am technically challenged at times, but our family has been quite successful using Zoom or FaceTime, and FaceTime's an Apple product. But it's very easy to get old iPods or iPads, old devices, old iPhones. I actually have some, so if you're close to Waterloo, I'd gladly loan them to you. And that would be something that a staff member could connect, or when your sisters are there, that they could have you on FaceTime. FaceTime is free, and it works as long as you've got Wi-Fi or you have a data plan. And it can be a great way for you to connect with your loved one. And it is a challenge. It's a distance and it's a difficult time. And I recognize that. Everything you had to tell me, I felt deeply, because I worked in long-term care for so long, and I also did infection control there. And so I know you're losing your mom bit by bit, and it's difficult. So the pandemic is such a difficult time, and things are so different, especially in places like long-term care, where you would want to be with her more often. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry that's happening, and I hope that you are able to connect and maybe use some technology. And if I can offer any suggestions on some of those ideas, feel free to we'll work out a way that you can connect with me if you'd like.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yes, I have one.
Go ahead, Jim.
I would like to know what it costs to die.
You'd like to what?
What does it cost to die? I'm serious.
I didn't quite hear what you said, Jim.
Dennis,
Oh,
he's
what does it cost to die?
yes, because we've read so many times that people are so shocked, like families are shocked because they have no idea how much it costs. Now,
And you have to go through a funeral home. And we consider we've been ripped off.
Betty, I
Well,
don't.
let's put that question to John.
Yeah.
Who better to respond to it? Oh, John, you're muted again.
John,
There we are. Jim, I hear you. Let me just declare this interest that I work for a local funeral home. I'm not promoting their services in particular, and I'm not a funeral director. But I want to clarify that the role of a funeral director may be in a funeral home, and it might be in something called a cremation service, but they are still licensed by the province to provide advice and assistance. When I started training more than 30 years ago in a small town, you used to go into what they called the casket selection room, because most people were buried in caskets, and there were little business cards above the casket, and you had to choose one. And it was a package deal. All the services, the casket and the burial and so forth. With all due respect to that director who taught me a lot, that's not how it goes any longer, because you should be able to choose the services you need, and you only pay for the services you need. And a director can guide you on that.
I know when I tried to do without a funeral director, they said that we were not allowed. Now, maybe things have changed. I looked after everything for Jim's mom and dad and my parents. And because we have a thing about funeral directors, we had a really bad experience with Jim's.
I hear you, and I should have honored that at the beginning, and I'm sorry to hear that. It happens in potentially any profession. And by the way, They're all regulated in the province now under something, and I commend their resources. It's called the Bereavement Authority of Ontario.
Okay.
Look up the BAO. I'll put it in the chat. And it explains the role and also the recourse. If you have any concerns in your planning, let alone your dying, BAO is there. They can't change the physical experience of death, but they can certainly represent you. Let me just acknowledge that that's unfortunate what you described. But let me also, from my experience in the hospital, offer a cautionary tale when families have tried to piece together with as little help as possible. And the most specific example I would give you is they tried to register the death by themselves. They said, well, I can go to City Hall and I can register the death. And they came back to me the next day and said, okay, now what do I do? They told me I have to wait 7 weeks to get proof from Thunder Bay, because that's where it comes from. And I can't close her bank account for 7 weeks. And I'm not trying to scare you, but I'm trying to illustrate why a funeral director is involved. Another example is families who've tried to transfer their own loved one, and it is possible. Remember I said the Act says the reverent disposition of the dead, which I'm sure we would all do for our loved ones. But believe me, it gets a little complicated trying to come to the hospital or go to a crematorium or to a cemetery with your own vehicle. So I'm almost out of my wheelhouse. I'm not a funeral director, but there are good reasons why they're available to help you, and there's recourse if you're not feeling well helped.
I'll tell you something else too. They did say, I know with Jim's dad, that we had to wait because if the crematorium is too busy, you have to have the body stored. And so therefore you have to use a funeral director and you have to pay storage fees and everything for your wait time.
Yeah,
That
that's
happened to
something
us.
I couldn't speak to very authoritatively. You will find some hospitals now do require you to work with a funeral director, and I stress, they're not certainly promoting any particular funeral home or any particular choice of arrangements, but they just need somebody to work with. And COVID, here's another example, folks. COVID has complicated our situation somewhat, not just in terms of how many can participate, but how it goes and how quickly it must go. Christine might be able to speak to that from long-term care, limits of how many hours a person who has died can remain where they died.
Yes.
So they have to go somewhere for a
Yes.
reverent disposition.
Bonita, you look like you were about to ask a question.
Oh, did I? You know what? There wasn't anything specifically. I'm just really amazed at how knowledgeable that everybody is. So I guess a little bit of my backstory too is I'm a registered nurse. I've just retired as well. I'm a lay minister, and I just finished my death doula course from Douglas College. So I was really interested in all of your knowledge, and I think we're moving ahead. So I just wanted to know what we are talking about. So I guess really, how do we bring this? Maybe that would be the question. How would we, with churches being not open at this time, or maybe open to a smaller community, sometimes it's difficult to reach people and teach them. Teaching to have this dialogue and open up this dialogue. So that's where I'm I'm personally struggling with that. I did a little teaching at the hospital that I did work at. So now I'm looking to go further and try and meet the needs of the community. So I'm trying to find I guess a personal space where I can help people on this journey as well. So.
John, can you respond to that?
Well, I was going to invite Christine because she's closer to the front lines now than I am.
Sorry, I just want to clarify your question about bringing forth the conversations of advanced care planning or death.
Well, I think in death overall, because working in the hospital, I'm sure, as you know, it wasn't an easy, we weren't trained to have an easy conversation about this. People have still that huge fear of opening up that
Oh,
dialogue.
Too much.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Oh, so I'm sorry. It's okay. It's okay. Don't worry.
I'll just mute Jim for a moment.
So, so I guess really I'd like to be a part of this movement is really what it is. It seems to be a new movement of opening up the dialogue in palliative care and death and dying, and helping people say goodbye to their loved ones when they need help. So really, the needs of the dying. So I guess really I don't really have a question. Maybe it's just I found my friend Christine told me that you were doing this conference, and I thought it sounded amazing. So I wanted to join in, and she says I think it's something you would really appreciate, and I really have appreciated many of your perspectives, and I'm just looking for a space where I fit in to all of this. So I'm just, yeah, praying for that, and wherever that happens, yeah, so.
Well, we just never know what great opportunities are ahead of us, you know, and so
Right?
I
Yes.
trust that, you know, and sometimes those opportunities end up being greater than what we hoped for.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
things have a way of working out. But I would say at this point, right now, you know, we're really heavily leaning on phone calls and Zoom
Yes.
for whatever we can. Very soon, especially in Southern Ontario, we will be looking forward to getting on the porch. I can't wait to get to my mom's front porch there. She's still with us, and
Oh,
I haven't been in her house since last summer, and we've had some very cold porch visits. And then we actually haven't had any in the last little while because it's so cold. So, you know, I think we can start having some nice outdoor visits and conversations with people, meaningful conversations where we are, you know, 6 or 10 feet apart. And so I think that that's an opportunity when you are with people to have those chats. And I think of it like a ripple effect. And so you have, you know, this conversation with someone or several people, and that ripple then affects, they go on to others. And so I think that your initial conversations, you really won't probably fully be able to appreciate what great things come of it, because it will be widespread. And so
Right.
I think you just start with individual conversations at this point until we can gather in crowds again. Won't that be great?
Oh, absolutely. I think
Yeah.
we're all looking forward to that very much. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Any other questions that people might have? If you're muted, just raise your hand and I'll do the unmuting. Okay, shall we call it a day? You know, it's soon going to be supper time, folks.
I think some,
All right.
Did somebody raise their hand? I'm sorry.
No.
No. Okay.
thanks, Danny. Thanks a
Okay.
lot.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you,
all.
everyone.
Thank you,
Okay.
everyone. It was a
Thank you,
wonderful afternoon.
It was helpful.
God bless.
And also with you.
Bye.
Bye now.
Stay safe. Stay safe.
Yep, you too.
John, thank you very much. Christine, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Well,
Jamie's gone back to work.
yeah. Will you be able to share his slides if people ask for them? Is that?
Oh, yes, no problem.
Okay.
I saw them all. I guess nobody else saw them.
Yeah.
There's 2 buttons and I pushed the wrong one. Yeah, well,
Hi,
So
Jake.
be-
How are you? It's nice to see you, Jake.
Indeed. There's
Oh.
Jake
Yep.
Henriette.
Jake going now. Yeah. And Laura, nice to see you, Laura. Good afternoon.
Dennis, can I ask, will we be able to see the questions in chat so that I can just try and follow up with some people? Or will that be lost once we close it?
No, I think the chat can stay.
The lecture I really wanted to hear, we missed.
Oh,
And Dennis apologized that he didn't let us in.
oh,
And that there were 4 parties in total. Well, Stumpers were 2. So
Henriette's not muted.
That's
Yeah, that's
Henriette
good.
talking to Jake.
Yeah, you did it. Yeah, thank you. Good. Well, I don't know if Laura, maybe she got taken away from her computer for a little bit. I'm assuming she's maybe not having any questions. Laura, if you're on and you have questions, just send it in the chat. Otherwise, we'll just assume that you have had to step away.
And there are some very good questions and comments, including from Shelley in the chat. And I don't know how to save it, but there is a way, whether it's part of the recording or you do a quick cut and paste
Oh, yes.
before we close.
Yeah, it's not one way or the other. We'll
I
get
can
them.
try to cut and paste it. I just don't know if it'll work.
Yeah.
Here, I'm trying that right now. Okay. I think I've got it.
Hi, Hope. Nice to see you.
hi, Christine. Wonderful to see you and hear you.
Yeah, you too.
Okay, I've got it. It's really dense, but I can send it to you.
Okay, thank
Okay,
you.
how did you do that, John?
I just did a cut and paste from the chat just to be sure, and it's timed and named, but you'll have to go through and you'll see how to highlight who's speaking by the
Right.
time signature.
Yeah. Okay, though. Did you just do a Control A and then a Control C?
Yeah, you'll see it just momentarily.
Yeah, okay.
I just
I got
am
it.
conscious it's confidential in a way, but the recording they gave consent, so.
Yeah. Yep, great. Everybody did a nice job. So what's our next subject?
Well, I had to take a whole bunch of my presentation out because I was way over and I was still a few minutes over, but the part I took out was about, which won't necessarily be what you want to talk about, but it was about what does it look like when you choose certain things? What does CPR all entail, and what does that mean if you're put on a ventilator, and what does it mean if you choose dialysis? I think some people know, but I don't think everyone knows. I don't think everybody knows if you have CPR and you don't start breathing on your own after that, you're put on a ventilator, and then that means you're in the ICU, and that means you also have a whole bunch of other tubes and lines and things automatically put in. So I don't know, do you think
I felt badly because I think it was some good material. Without seeing it, how to know what to edit.
Yeah, that's okay.
That's
was
right.
just a
There's
thought.
only so much time available, for sure.
Yeah. I don't know. Do you have? Yeah, I guess there's so many different areas to talk about.
I've started to highlight these, but there's just so many. If you can just read down, you'll see it's all there. There must be 60 entries, I think.
Oh, okay.
Most are back and forth, but a couple of really good points. Here it comes.
Did you get everything in one sweep with the cut and paste, John?
I did. It's just
Okay.
I
I'll try to-
underestimated trying to highlight the time signatures. It's not too bad. You just have to read. Okay, well, we can reflect some more and see what other comments you get back. And
Are they being sent by email then?
they just left.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
As I try and click down on them, I know it's jumping and I'm not seeing all of them. So thank you.
I've got them, and I copied Philip and Dennis and Jamie. So
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much.
Nice, John.
okay, well,
Okay,
I'll leave you to debrief any further and bid you a good afternoon.
bid you a
Okay.
good afternoon, and let's see, 6 o'clock is the next Zoom meeting, so there you go.
I'm just wondering, Stumpers may not know they haven't signed off, and same with Laura Starr, but other than that.
Yeah, but if we end the meeting, then they'll be
Oh,
done, right?
Henriette knows we haven't signed off because it was just Jake there. He wouldn't sign off.
So.
Laura, I don't know Laura, so. Okay,
All right,
doke.
well, I think I'm gonna leave too, so we'll see you later.
Okay, doke.
Bye, have a great day. Great evening. We're almost at that point.
Yeah. 2 more Zoom meetings to go today. Let's see, I can.